Welcome to Chess Dog. This is John. I'm back from my first tournament in almost, I guess, been almost 2 years. And, going into this tournament, I'm trying to work towards my master rating. And I was nervous. I had been a director of a couple of tournaments so far, the last 6 months or so. And I noticed everybody was playing really, really well. Like everybody that was 1850 looked like they were playing like they were 2050. I guess a lot of people were studying chess during the pandemic and people were improving. And my worry was that even, I was rating of 2160 coming into this tournament, that I might be behind. I might find all of a sudden that I was overrated, that I didn't belong, in the tournament. And I was nervous about how I was going to do. It turns out I didn't need to be too nervous. This video is going to cover, it's going to cover the first 3 rounds that I was in, but it's sort of easy to do the first round because for me, the first round didn't happen. I sat down at the board and started the clock, and 20 minutes later, my opponent was not there. So I'm wondering what's going on. It's the first round of the tournament. And eventually the tournament director comes to me and tells me that my opponent actually had changed sections. I was in the open section, and they were rated, 1780, 1790, which is almost 400 points lower than me, which actually makes me more nervous than anything else. And they had decided to change into what was known as the reserve section. There were 3 sections, and the reserve section was the middle section. And so they weren't there, which meant I got a first-round bye and a full point. And I was sort of relieved. A 7-round tournament becomes a 6-round tournament. My chance of, only bad things could have happened to my rating. I wouldn't have gained any points if I had won. But the one thing I did lose out on is sort of that orientation game. You got first game of the tournament, you're kind of feeling your way. You're lubricating your brain a little bit. I didn't get that. So my first game was my opponent's second game. And that game, my first game, was against a young man named Lichess. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and I would guess he's around 12 years of age. And he had the white pieces in our game, and he began with the move d4. I played the King's Indian, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3 castles, bishop e2, e5. Now, one of the reasons black plays the King's Indian is because black wants to play for a win. It's an aggressive choice. It's an attempt to complicate the game, to attack white's structure. But it became clear after my opponent's next move that he was playing for a draw from the move go. And let me give you my philosophy on that. When someone, particularly with the white pieces, says, I'm just going to play for a draw at every turn, because when they do that, even if he was rated around 1880, so it's about a 300-point rating disparity between us, that when they do that, some people complain about it. But my rule is, your moves are your business, my moves are my business. In other words, he has the right to do whatever he wants. He makes the moves that he wants to make. And the burden is on me to sufficiently complicate the play and create winning chances. It's not his responsibility. He can do whatever he wants. So I have no problem with the decision he made. I wish he had made a different decision. It would have been better for me. But so it goes. So he plays the King's Indian exchange variation, gets queens off the board. So the queens are off. The pawn structure is completely symmetrical. And it's tough for black to win from this position. It's not that easy for white to win either. This does have a tendency to be drawish. But I'm saying, look, I'm going to try to outplay my opponent. He plays bishop g5, which pins the knight at f6, a standard move. And I play rook to f8. Now, this is my first attempt to complicate the game. The most common move here is rook to e8. And a line, for example, was knight to d5, knight takes, pawn takes, c6 to challenge the center, then bishop c4. Now, what black would like to do here is to expand on the queen side with b5. Then when the bishop retreats to b3, expand further with a5. The problem with this is that when white plays a4 and black takes and white takes with the bishop, you'll notice that there's a pin on the c6 pawn because of the rook situated at e8. So instead of playing the e8, I played the rook to f8. And now this variation works. So if white plays knight to d5 here, then knight takes, pawn takes, c6, bishop c4, expanding on the queen side just the same, pawn takes. Now there is no pin on the c6 pawn. The rook's at f8, not e8. And I can play cd5 if they take ed5, bishop to a6. Keeps white from castling king side. And this position is still equal, but it's unbalanced. So there are more opportunities to play for a win. But he unfortunately did not go into that line. He castled long, and that makes my chances of winning a little tougher. I played knight to c6. You'll notice the only real weakness white has in his position is this d4 square. I mean, maybe if he gets careless, f2 could become a little vulnerable, but d4 is the main weakness. And because of that, h3 is the most common move, because he doesn't want black to play bishop g4, bishop takes f3. But he did not play that. He played a3, which I was happy about. So bishop g4, h3, bishop f3, knight to d4. So now my knight is on that nice d4 square. You'll notice that the square at d5 isn't protected in the same way, because black could kick out a knight from that square with c6. White can't do that to my knight. But he plays very accurately. He plays knight to b5, and I play what is probably the best move here, c5. And then he takes my knight, knight d4, cd4. Now, I have a protected passed pawn in the middle of the board, but this is really more of a symbolic advantage here, I think, than an actual advantage. Although I could be wrong. I haven't done a real in-depth analysis of the game. He takes at f6, f6, so he gives up the two bishops. But my remaining bishop is definitely limited by my central pawns. Bishop e2, rook fc8, attacking the c4. It's defended already, but he putting pressure on it. Rook a to b8, hoping to... I want to open up lines on the queen side and attack his king. He plays h4, and I'm a little worried about him advancing to h5 and maybe opening up some pressure on the king side, so I block it with h5. He plays b3, protecting his c4 pawn. And in this position, it might have been a good attempt to play something like bishop e7 to hit the a3 pawn, king b2, rook c6, f3, a5, a4. And then here, the computer thinks black's doing pretty well after the move f5, trying to create a pawn roller in the center, hopefully. But even here, white has to be agreeable to that. It's just very hard to create winning chances for black. I instead played king to g7, a4, rook h8. I was worried about d4 and then h5 and him opening up lines here, so I prevent that immediately. g3, rook b to e8, f3, and here I played bishop to d8, and I offered a draw, which he accepted at the speed of light, instantly. Now, some might be critical. I'm really maybe critical myself here of offering a draw to an opponent who was much lower rated. But I hadn't played in a serious tournament in a couple of years. And in the first round of that tournament, I lost a game to a lower rated player, making a blunder in a winning endgame. And I just wanted to, continue the tournament and just, accept the situation as it was. It may have been a mistake. Maybe it's a part of my chess character I have to work on. But I did offer a draw here. I didn't see a way to win opposite colored bishops. No completely open files for the rooks. So that was my decision, and he accepted. So that was the first game I played in this tournament. The second game I played was against a player named, his name is Kai, and his last name is spelled Tsuei. A young man, I say 19, 20-ish, a student at the University of Chicago, smart kid, rated around 1970. Just like my previous opponent, who gained about 60 rating points in the tournament, he also had a very, very good tournament. I say it was around 1970 entering the tournament, and he was over 2,000 by the time the tournament ended. This time I had the white pieces, and I played d4, d5, c4, and he plays knight to c6, the Chigorin variation, where you violate a principle. You block this c7 pawn, which is usually a primary source of black's counterplay, but black is saying, I'm just going to get my pieces out as fast as possible and see if that, can compensate for blocking that pawn. I took on d5, queen d5, e3. This is all theory. e5, knight to c3, threatening the queen. He pins that knight to the king. a3, bishop c3, bc3. So my idea here is to play c4, kick the queen away, then maybe d5, expand forward in the center. I can play a4 and bishop to a3, put that bishop on a really strong diagonal. And if you'll notice the position, I don't have any pieces developed, but I have a much better pawn structure, and I have the two bishops. So unless he does something with his development very quickly, and there never is anything he can do, because it's hard to do something to an opponent with a better structure, he's going to have a difficult time here. He's given me two advantages, structure and the two bishops, so that even if he neutralizes one of them, I'll still have the other one. So he removes the queen from the c4 push immediately. I play a4, threatening to put the bishop on a3. He takes on d4. I take with the c-pawn. I have two central pawns. He has none. Knight f6, knight f3, bishop f5. I play bishop e2, not a very aggressively posted piece, but I just want to catch up in development. My two bishop advantage and my structural advantages are long term. They're not going anywhere. So as long as I get my king to safety and get my pieces out, I should be in pretty good shape. Castles, rook fe8, queen to b3, aiming at the b7 pawn. You'll notice those pawns, black's pawns on the queen side, are really more targets than anything else. I'm going to put my pieces on the b and c files and attack those pawns. Bishop e4, he wants to establish a blockade on those central light squares so I can't advance my center. Bishop a3 hitting the queen. Queen moves back. Rook fc1, putting pressure on the half-open c-file. a6, he wants to keep my bishop from popping into the b5 square and pinning that knight. So I need to break his control of the central light squares on e4 and d5. So I play knight to e1. This allows my bishop to either go to f3 or d3 to challenge his bishop. Maybe I can play f3, e4 later at some point. We'll see. He moves the bishop back to d5, hitting my queen. Queen goes to c2. Queen to e6, furthering his control over the light squares. I also have to worry at some point the bishop might be able to come in here. So I play bishop to c4, offering the trade of one of those bishops to break his light square blockade in the center. He plays knight to e7 to reinforce that blockade, and now bishop takes knight. So I've given up the two bishops, but I'm left with the structural advantage, and black doesn't have anything. He doesn't have his lead in development. He doesn't have his blockade. I'm just left with a better structure. Rook e7, knight to d3. Of course, I have these two squares potentially for that knight. It's a strong piece. It could even go to f4 if I wanted. Queen g4, the not so subtle threat of checkmating me on the g2 square. Okay. Bishop takes bishop. Knight d5, rook a to b1. And you'll see my heavy pieces are putting unbearable pressure on my opponent's queen side pawns. He plays c6. That allows this knight to, the rook at e7 to defend the pawn at b7 from attack. Knight to c5. My pieces are perfectly placed, putting maximum pressure on the queen side. Queen to c8. And my concern, it didn't need to be a concern, was that he was going to, if I played a5 here, I was concerned he would play knight to c7 and then blockade on the b5 square. But it turns out if he did that, I could have just taken on b7. So I didn't have to worry about that. But I decided to expand in the center, play on more than one side of the board. Knight f6, now I can go a5. in my brain. I could have done it anyway, but in my brain now I can do it because his knight can't blockade there. G6, getting rid of any back rank mating threats that could occur. F3, strengthening the center. Rook C7. Queen to C3, creating some X-ray pressure against the knight. Maybe at some point I can advance the pawn to D5 and threaten to take the knight with my queen. Knight to D7. He wants to trade those knights. My knight is much better than his, and I have space, so I don't want to trade. Bring the knight back. Queen D8, Rook D1, put the rook opposite the queen. Rook A to C8. So now I have another strategy. I wasn't able to win a pawn on the queen side, but my pieces are much better placed. I can advance my center and put my knight on the F6 or D6 square and really do a lot of damage there. So E5, the idea is the knight can go to C2, E4, then to F6 or D6. Knight to F8, knight C5, queen to E7, knight E4. Again, aiming my knight at one of these two weaknesses in his position. Knight to D7, controlling the F6 square, and F4. Now, at this point, I have a very, very strong position. The computer gives me +4 at this point, even though the material is even. I'm in very good shape. F6, trying to chip away at my overpowering center. Knight to D6, hitting the rook at C8. The rook moves to D8, but now knight takes B7. I win a pawn. And at this point, if I don't make a tactical blunder, I know I'm going to win this game. The rook goes to F8, knight to D6, C5, again trying to attack this central structure of mine. Queen to C4, check. King to G7, rook to E1, FE5, DE5, and he plays knight to B8, rook to F1 to defend my F4 pawn, G5. And I missed a tactic here. I knew my position is good enough that I'm going to win either way, but it would have been nice if I had seen rook takes knight, because if he plays rook takes rook, knight to F5, check, forking the king and the queen. That would have been nice, but that didn't happen. Rook B to E1, knight C6, queen E4, knight to D4. Now F5. Now I've got these two strong pawns advancing in the center of the board, and his king is very exposed. King H8, queen to D5, knight C2, hitting my rook at E1, F6, attacking his queen, queen to D8. And there are a lot of different ways to win this position. I didn't win it in the most efficient way, but played rook E2, evading the knight's attack, knight D4, rook E to F2, knight to B5, trying to exchange off my knight. Rook goes to D1. I'm fine if he wants to do that. I'm still very, very strong, very good shape. Knight to D4, E6. Now, there's a rule that two pawns abreast on the 6th rank are as strong as a rook. So I have a very strong position. If he plays rook to F6, for example, knight to F7, check, unveiling an attack on the now undefended queen would happen. Knight to E2, check. Rook takes E2, so now I play queen F6. Knight F7, check. King G7, knight G5, C4, E7, rook takes E7, rook takes rook, queen E7, knight E6, check, king F6, knight takes rook, and he can't even recapture the knight with the queen, because if he does, I play rook F1, check, skewering the king to the queen, queen to E3, check, king H1, queen to E2, and it turns out I actually have a forced mate here, which I didn't even bother to look at. It goes like this: knight D7, king G6, queen D6, king F5, rook D5, king E4, queen E5. Mate is one of the lines. But I just said, let's just get the queens off the board. The endgame will be a mop-up. Queen to F3, check. And my opponent resigned. He went on to have an excellent tournament, by the way. He didn't lose again until the last round, where he was paired against a 2300 rated player. So congratulations to him on having a good tournament. So those are my first 3 rounds of this 7-round tournament, and it got pretty interesting. Particularly some of my games moving forward are very rich, very complicated. I look forward to going over those in the coming days. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog, and see you again soon. Bye.